the challenges we're now facing, both as a nation as a world, the challenges span sectors. They're no longer limited to being just private sector or just public sector or just academia or even nonprofits. The challenges span sectors, and so as a result, our fates are intertwined. And so we seem to be doing really good on investments in the private sector. In fact, you can look at the rise in IPOs and sort of the health of the economy there. But if we don't think about the health of the other sectors, including the public sector, then we do ourselves a disservice going forward as a nation.
Why do you think we've gotten ourselves into such a silo mentality, thinking about the United States as a whole or the economy as a whole?
Yeah, so I think it's an interesting thing that it seems to be unique to the United States. You can look at sort of interesting models in Singapore or in Europe where they have both public and private, but then they have this sort of quasi-government organizations that are sort of public-private partnerships. I think the U.S., it actually dates back to our founders. They were concerned about a rise of the king, and so they actually, if you go back to Federalist Papers number 51, they wanted ambition to counter ambition. They wanted turf wars. And so as a result, I think we've sort of, up until now, we've always seen that you're either a distinctly public sector or a distinctly private sector. You're never something that's sort of spanning both. But I think that does ourselves a disservice, particularly going forward when other countries are thinking about it. How can we do more interesting public-private partnerships? And also, how can we think about the health of our public sector sort of serving as that foundation to continuing a robust private sector?
You write that, you kind of get at the nut of this by writing, perhaps as part of a three-way dialogue among the U.S. public, the private sector, and civil servants, we discuss how the work of civil services could be redesigned to encourage greater grassroots participation and greater visibility into what public servants are doing for the benefit of we the people. Now, this is something that the administration has tried to a degree, and the Bush administration tried to a degree, so it's not just an administration-to-administration issue.
Right.
It strikes me that it's more of a government as we know it problem in being able to transition to the kind of world that you're thinking about. And it seems like there's a willingness to do it. It just seems like figuring out the way forward and then actually putting nose to the grindstone and doing it is where the holdup is right now. Do you think that's fair to say?
I think that's very fair to say, and I think the challenge is it needs to be, like you said, exactly a three-way dialogue, because there are a lot of great ideas in the private sector that can come in, but we also have to recognize that government was designed to operate differently than business. And again, to go back to the founders, the phrase they said, if all men were angels, no government would be necessary, they actually were worried about a king, and so they did want sort of a slowness. You didn't want things to change overnight because that might be a consolidation of power to the detriment of the democracy. And they did want turf wars. And so some of the things that currently the public sort of may see and say, well, that's a bad thing about government because it doesn't seem to be doing what business sector is doing, recognize that was intentional to design. But that doesn't mean we can't think about how do we redesign the incentives to actually have different behaviors. How can we encourage horizontal collaborations? That would be one area that I think would be great to have a dialogue between political appointees in addition to the private sector and actual, career government people. How do we address the fact that the Economy Act does sort of create a disincentive for people to actually collaborate across initiatives, because that's one of the few things that could actually send you to jail if you use your money for purposes other than your own agency.
You write in this piece about this three-way dialogue in such a way that it leads me to believe, though, that if all three parties are not equally interested and equally engaged, it's not going to be successful. And my sense is that right now, at least, this isn't something that the general public in the United States seems to care about unless and until something happens like the government shutdown that we've just gone through.
Right, and I think actually maybe it's a case where we can involve the public to have awareness, but I really think the real sort of interest in making sure that there is as equal or as good a balance of the investments in the public sector as the private sector will actually come from corporate entities. Because as you saw, there was a little bit of a dip in the stock market when the shutdown was going on, and there was concerns about the debt ceiling. And so I think it may be that actually business can actually think on the long-term horizon and actually say, wait, if we don't have a healthy public sector that's actually making sure that we can have interstate commerce, we can have transportation necessary, we can have the defenses we need, and even, in public health, whenever you think about sort of like the pandemic flu, if they think about the fact that if we were to lose that, we wouldn't actually be able to even do commerce in this country, they may actually be the ones that could actually have sort of the impetus to actually come to that table and actually have that dialogue.
How do we get around, in trying to formulate that discussion, how do we get around the big bad corporate image and bring them into this conversation on kind of an equal footing?
Right. I think it's creating a safe space. And I do think there's some different places that you can probably look to in government where we could actually say, if a political appointee was interested in having a dialogue on that issue, in addition, they brought together maybe it's the banking sector, maybe it's folks that do commerce or do communications. It could also be people that then are from government themselves and just sort of say, look, what are the things each of us needs to get our jobs done? And sort of listening to the private sector to say what their needs are. Ideally, you have public groups representing what the public wants to have in that interest. It might be ensuring that there's privacy, making sure that things happen safely and securely. And then sort of government can say, well, here are the things that sort of are currently the constraints of, I'd almost put in quotation marks, the operating system we have. And whatever the government operating system has does not mean we can't redesign it, but it's sort of understanding how it's currently designed and then actually have an open dialogue about how we could actually begin to change the incentives to have the right behaviors we want to have occur.
David Bray is the Chief Information Officer at the Federal Communications Commission. He's writing Investing in the Right Places on his personal blog, and his opinions are his own. David, the landscape of this is doable, it seems, but potentially pretty challenging. You're framing this in such a way that there are models in other places, and you've mentioned some of those places where those are happening. How do we maybe open people's minds to the idea that other people might have some good ideas too? We've heard about this in various aspects of operations in the federal government and in the way the federal government interacts with the private sector and with the public, that they do it really well, fill in the blank name of country, and people are hesitant to look at those models and potentially adopt them or adapt them to our needs.
Right, and I think that's sort of just human behavior. It's one of those things that if I didn't do it, it's not going to work, and that's maybe sort of entrenched to the can-do attitude of the U.S. I think what would be a little interesting to sort of put forward and see if the public engaged is it's almost gotten to the point where if we don't start looking at how do we refashion ourselves and sort of set a direction for where the United States wants to go in the 21st century, that itself is actually a national security risk. And I don't want to be too out there and sort of saying that, but if you think about it, the Cold War was actually sort of the challenge between whether or not a free market economy combined with a representative democracy was superior to communism with central planning. And fortunately, we seem to have demonstrated that sort of our democracy, representative democracy in a free market was superior. But now you actually see other nation states saying, okay, well, fine, we'll adopt capitalism, but we'll do it as capitalism with a dictatorship or capitalism with an oligarchy. And guess what? That can be much more efficient in making decisions, not necessarily good decisions or decisions that give up free rights, but it can be much more efficient and faster at making decisions than a representative democracy. And so we need to figure out how can we actually figure out our next round of the game in this global game that still allows us to keep the freedoms and the things that we enjoy as liberties, but at the same time don't have us be trumped by those that are either doing capitalism with a dictatorship or capitalism with an oligarchy.
You wrap this piece up, David, which we have linked at federalnewsradio.com/in-depth by writing, we must readjust our investment portfolio before the benefits our robust public sector historically provided to gird our private sector are eroded in a global marketplace. We must attract, recruit, and retain talent in our public sector to help it adapt to 21st century challenges and new opportunities. Now, I've talked on any number of occasions on this program about what some of the challenges are that to doing the attraction, recruitment, and retention of talent. It strikes me that the mundane issues and the little things that you deal with in your day job at the FCC are really trumped by the broader importance of getting this done, and I wonder how you get from there to there, if that makes sense.
Oh, that's great to say, Francis, and that's a really good question. And I think the way I sort of to get from there to there is the idea that we want to encourage the best and the brightest to come to government because they love a challenge. I was lucky enough and maybe crazy enough to actually, believe it or not, join government when I was 15, which I know is kind of odd.
Did you cheat?
No, I actually got a work permit, and it was a Department of Energy facility. I had to get a work permit, but I just love the sense of a mission and challenge. And I think you can find that, the model exists in the military too, the sort of the hoorah. And I think we need that sort of same sort of leaders that are willing to inspire that public service and have the public feel that palpability of these are people that know we're in challenging times and that we know we need to figure out how do we redesign the incentives to get the right things out that we need for the 21st century, that the old operating system model may need to be adapted. But guess what? We've got a can-do attitude. We're going to make it work no matter what it is. And, whether that happens just with the individual agency that I work at now or whether that becomes infectious and spreads to sort of a more viral meme, I'd love to. And I think that's where, what you're doing with your radio program, it's a great service to sort of begin to inspire people to have that sort of can-do attitude that, this is something that's the work of the nation, and it's the work of the nation that's the bridges between the public sector and the private sector in addition to nonprofits and academia.